Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us for this morning's webinar. Um, for those who've joined us before on previous sessions, we like to keep these things interactive if we can. We'll be sharing a lot of information, experiences, tips with you. But if you do have any questions as we go through, or if you want to share any of your own experiences of the topics that we're talking about, please feel free to interject, ask any questions in the chat box, or just interrupt us. We're not precious about it, are we, Julie? So
no,
please do get involved.
fire away.
Yeah, and today's topic that we're gonna be covering is all to do with gender identity in the workplace. Something that we've been asked about quite a few times by clients, but also when we ask for suggestions for topics for these sessions, it's always a popular one. So without further ado, we'll dive straight in, and we'll start talking about gender identity in the workplace. Now, due to quite a lot of, well, quite rapid societal cultural changes in recent years, many employers are increasingly involved in managing members of staff who are trans or gender non-conforming individuals, and we'll come on to some of the terminology as well when we go through the issues. But it's becoming a much more topical, if we can use that phrase, issue for employers to deal with. And today's webinar is therefore about exploring this issue in more detail, with particular focus on the relevant terminology, and that does change a lot, and there's different opinions on that side of things, but we'll do our best to share some of the guidance on those kind of issues, and also, quite importantly, the legal obligations required of all employers, and also, as we like to do, share some good working practices, some tips, some of the things that we've seen and dealt with. So the first question that we're going to chat through is around exactly what is trans, what do we mean by trans when we use that term. Now, in an updated guidance document, ACAS, as many of you will be familiar with dealing with ACAS and using some of their guides, they use the term trans as an umbrella term to include both transsexual people, so individuals, for example, that may be assigned female at birth, who transition or are transitioning to live as a man, or for example, an individual assigned male at birth who has transitioned or is transitioning to live as a woman. But it also includes individuals with a non-binary gender identity, so someone who may identify as neither male or female, or both, or at different times may have different identities. So transitioning or gender reassignment is the process by which a person aligns their life and their physical identity to match their gender identity. So we're going to move on to, as I say, discussing some of the specific gender identity terminology which we'll be familiar with, which we may need to be aware of as employers when we're dealing with issues like this in the workplace. And the ACAS guide again suggests that wherever possible, clearly non-triggering language should be used. So we should seek to avoid terminology that's going to alienate people or offend them or upset them wherever we possibly can. Now, that is obviously can potentially be a challenge in some circumstances, given that the terminology in the transgender field is something that's constantly evolving, as understanding and perceptions of gender variant conditions, expressions, identities changes over time. So there can clearly be differences of opinion about what terms are acceptable, are appropriate, and the acceptance of certain terms can differ among different people and different groups, and from individual to individual. That's the case with any thing. That may be the case in terminology used to describe people's backgrounds and heritage and races and things like that, and also disability status. There's lots of different terminology, and so there's not one single consensus on what the precise language should be, but the idea of approaching these things by avoiding triggering language or offensive language is clearly the best starting point. I'm just now going to pass over to Julie, who's going to start taking us through a few of these terms which you'll have heard, and just how we understand them to be defined in this context.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. So obviously taking into account what Gareth has said, it is language in this area is really important. And when I was preparing some of this webinar, it was an education for me as well. So there's lots of particular terms that have certain meanings, and the meaning has changed slightly, or they're considered kind of not really appropriate anymore. So we're just going to take you through some of the language to arm yourself at this stage with that information. So the first one obviously is gender reassignment, and that is the process of transitioning from one binary gender to another. And when a person takes steps to alter the outward expression of their gender so that it better aligns with their sense of how they identify themselves. I think it's important to note that for some, but not all, this will involve medical intervention to adjust their appearance so that it aligns with their gender identity. So some people, as you may well know, will take hormones or will undergo surgery as part of their gender reassignment. But medical intervention is not required for someone to reassign their gender. And often they will, I say simply, but often what they will have changed is their gender role, their name, their pronouns, perhaps the way they dress, their body language, the way they speak, how they carry themselves, their hairstyle. All of these are included in reassigning gender. So it's not limited to someone who has taken medical steps. So that brings us on to a gender recognition certificate, and that's something that has been issued under what's called the Gender Recognition Act, which was around in 2004, and that's a certificate enabling an individual to be legally recognised in their affirmed gender under the legislation. But an individual does not need to possess a GRC, this certificate, in order to qualify for protection under the Equality Act. So you may or may not end up dealing with employees who consider that they have reassigned their gender, but they don't have any paperwork, so to speak, but that person will still be protected under equality legislation. So then we go into some of the kind of umbrella terms, and the big umbrella term is transgender, often shortened to trans. So an umbrella term used to cover a number of different gender identity labels, and it's commonly used to include both transsexual, which is changing gender, and non-binary identities. But the term doesn't actually appear in legislation. The term that does appear in legislation is specifically transsexual, and that's used to describe a person who has the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, which, if we remember, doesn't mean that you have to have had medical intervention. It doesn't specifically cover non-binary gender identities, but I would imagine that it either may change, or that you would err on the side of caution to still treat a non-binary individual under that kind of term, a transsexual, and therefore they're getting protection from the legislation. A transsexual person may or may not undergo gender reassignment. So ultimately a transsexual person identifies as a member of the gender opposite that they're either proposing to undergo, they are undergoing, or have undergone gender reassignment. Importantly, the term is now considered outdated in general usage and is being replaced more by the terms transgender or trans, but this is just a word that appears in the legislation, which is why we covered it. And in fact, it's actually considered offensive. ACAS say it's not appropriate to use a noun, so he or she is a transsexual. And that leads us on to other terms kind of that come under this umbrella that again are becoming more and more commonly used, and so we want to arm you with information as to what they actually mean. Pass you back to Gareth for that.
Thanks, Julie. So a few other important terms to understand. One is bigender. Now that's a person who considers themselves to be both male and female at different times. Another phrase is cis or cisgender, and that's where the sex assigned at birth and the gender identity are congruent. So a term used effectively to break down the idea that non-trans people don't need a descriptor. The cis derives from the Latin term for on the side of, and some trans individuals may find that term offensive. But it helps to break, as I say, break down this idea that you avoid using potentially offensive terminology like normal or something, that kind of idea of there being a normal. It's actually not. It's all part of a spectrum of different identities. So this idea of being able to give a descriptor to people whose identity and birth assigned sex are essentially the same. Another phrase that's often used and used particularly in everyday discourse is cross-dresser. Now that's obviously anyone may wear clothes associated with a different sex at any given time, but this term typically refers to men who occasionally wear clothes, makeup and accessories, which are culturally otherwise associated with women. And this replaces the term transvestite, which according to AHAS is generally viewed as inappropriate and likely to cause offence. And that may be something that's very different from someone that's transitioning. It may simply be a facet of their lifestyle or personality, but that they have. Another phrase you may hear used is differences in sex development, or often shortened to DSD. And this is a bit more of a medical term, and it's defined by the NHS as a group of rare medical conditions which involve genes, hormones, reproductive organs, which may mean that a person's sex development is different from most other people's. In those circumstances, some people may prefer the term intersex or the use of term variations of sex development, VSD. Another phrase, gender dysphoria, incongruence. Now that's where a person experiences distress due to the mismatch between the sex they were assigned at birth and the gender they identify with. Conforming to society's cultural expectation can cause an individual persistent personal discomfort, accompanying a desire to live in the opposite gender of birth. And that's clearly an area where employers can potentially look out for where they can offer support for someone who may be going through a difficult time when they're feeling these periods of distress. Gender fluid is another term that means an individual who may change how they feel or how they identify in terms of gender from time to time. So they may identify as a woman on some days, a man on others, a combination of both, and that's much more fluid situation. And gender identity, just as a general phrase that we've been using, psychological identification of oneself. This is where, or this may be as a boy, man, or a girl, woman, binary model, or maybe one of the other identity labels. And this is the term that the Women and Equalities Committee in their Transgender Equality Inquiry report recommended should be used instead of the current language in the Equalities Act of gender reassignment. So they were looking to change that terminology, which is quite a number of years old now, and maybe does need some update. Certainly in the opinion of this committee, it does. So that's where that phrase comes from. I'm just going to pass back to Julie. There's a couple more to take us through, and then we'll move on to some of the more legal aspects.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. So we also have the phrase gender neutral, and that's a person who doesn't identify with any gender. They may embrace aspects of both male and female, or man and woman, and may possibly fall in a spectrum between the two. And this is where, I don't know if any of you have heard a gender neutral pronouns, such as describing someone as they rather than he or she. I was watching a programme where they were describing a gender neutral person as they, and I wasn't understanding because I thought they're only talking about one person, but they're using they. But once you've got obviously your ear tuned into it, you understand that's why they're using that word. They also can use words like pair or Z, Zay, and Faye, and use a gender neutral title such as MX rather than Mr, Mrs, Ms, Miss. I remember I thought it was cutting edge when I dabbled in Ms, but that's old school now. So MX is something that you may see. Intersex. The anatomy of physiology of an intersex person differs from contemporary stereotypes of what constitutes male or female. So they feel that their appearance at birth is atypical, being neither male nor female. That's actually a physical condition as opposed to gender identity. Back in the day, that's probably would have been described as a hermaphrodite. That is not a word that's used anymore. It's intersex. Non-binary, so not identifying solely with either male or female. A non-binary person may say they're neither gender, or they may have another sense of gender, such as pangender, polygender, or third gender. These are it's the sort of language that you must be equipped with and alive to, and then you can obviously discuss it with the person in front of you, and that you fully understand what their view is. We just want to equip you with, as I say, the various terminology. Sex, a term referring to the male-female physical development, and it's historically judged entirely on genital appearance at birth. And that's where you get some of these controversies where people say sex is immutable rather than fluid. So some people will use sex to describe the physiology and gender to describe the feeling, if that's not too blunt a way of describing it. Sexual orientation, I'm sure you all are aware of that. So that's about sexual attraction, and that's a separate issue to gender identity. I do often feel in these conversations that orientation and identity do get lumped together somewhat unfairly, because it's a totally different issue. So a trans person may be heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, or even asexual. And finally, in our dictionary today, we've got transition, which we obviously have touched on. So that's a series of social, psychological, emotional, and sometimes medical steps a person takes to present in a gender identity they wish to take. So as we've mentioned, it doesn't always need to be medical, but it's transition. It's the term used to describe a permanent, full-time adaptation of the gender role in all spheres of this person's life, family, work, etc. And the steps and timescale for transitioning will, of course, vary from individual to individual. So we have touched on it, but we just wanted to give you a little bit of information about the Gender Recognition Act 2004. So I'll pass you back to Gareth to do that.
Thanks, Julie, and yeah, thanks for taking us through some of those terms. I know there was quite a few there, but we did think it was useful to explain some of them, simply because in quite a lot of the cases that we see on this, misunderstanding about terminology, and communication and understanding can be kind of at the core of some of the misunderstandings and issues, and inadvertently lead to things like harassment claims and things like that, where people may deliberately or naively, ignorantly, maybe a more accurate description, use the wrong terminology and cause offence and upset for colleagues. And so it's useful just to, obviously this is evolving, it does change, but just to have that understanding of actually, look, what do some of these things mean, and what's the difference between them, and what's the current sort of cultural norm around some of them. So that's why we just wanted to do that, because that's where we've seen a few people trip up with issues in our experience. Now, moving on to the Gender Recognition Act from 2004. As we've kind of briefly touched on, this provides a mechanism for someone to be legally recognised in and gain the rights and responsibilities of their gender affirmed through gender reassignment, i.e. transitioning from a man to a woman or a woman to a man, and obtaining a certificate under this legislation can lead to the issue, or does lead to the issuing of a new or replacement birth certificate, which reflects the holder's new gender, provided the birth was registered in the UK. An individual must be 18 years of age or older to apply for one of these certificates, and indeed that's an area of um, debate and protest around whether that age should be lowered, but currently it is 18 years of age. Now, where a full gender recognition certificate is issued to a person, the person's gender becomes, for all purposes, the acquired gender. So that if the acquired gender is the male gender, then the person's sex becomes that of a man, and if it's the female gender, it becomes the sex of a woman. Therefore, a male to female transsexual person can bring an equality of terms claim in their acquired female gender from the date their certificate's issued, but probably only really in relation to events which occur after that time. The Act that we're talking about, which currently only applies, as I say, to those aged 18 or older, requires applicants to satisfy a gender recognition panel, which is basically a judicial body of doctors and lawyers that they have or have had gender dysphoria, that we talked about earlier, that period of distress of having misaligned gender identity from what you've been assigned, if we can describe it that way. They also need to show that they have lived in the acquired gender or the gender that they want to transition to for at least 2 years prior to the application, and that they intend to live permanently in the required gender. Crucially, however, physical medical intervention is not necessary to receive a gender recognition certificate. Now, strict privacy requirements are set out in Gender Recognition Act, and if a person has a gender recognition certificate, information about their gender history is what's known as protected information under that legislation. As a result, it becomes a criminal act, and there can be liability to a fine for the person who acquires that protected information and then discloses it to any other person. So where they've received that information in an official capacity, so for example, a recruitment process or in the course of employment, and that information is then disclosed to another person, that can be a breach of the privacy rights under the Gender Recognition Act. Now, there are exceptions to that offence, which include where the individual agrees to the disclosure of the information, if it's required to prevent or investigate a crime, etc. But all of this essentially creates a scenario where we need to be aware that asking an employee or a job applicant if they have a gender recognition certificate, or asking to see it as some sort of condition of employment, is not permitted, and it could be regarded as harassment and discrimination under the Equality Act. Again, we mentioned this earlier, but receiving one of those certificates is not a prerequisite to one of your employees, for example, informing you of their gender identity, changing their pronouns, the way they dress, how they like to be treated. They don't need a certificate for those purposes, and may still and will still have action under the Equality Act. Now, I'm just going to pass you back to Julie, who's going to take us through some of the key areas to be aware of for employers, and things that we've experienced in helping clients with these issues.
Thanks, Gareth. So forgive me, I think some of this might sound like we're stating the obvious, but we just want to highlight where there's kind of an intersection between what we're talking about and everyday decisions and issues that you may have to deal with. And some are more likely to arise than others. So the first area we're going to look at is terms and conditions of employment, including pay. So an employer should ensure, obviously, that there are no terms and conditions of employment that disadvantage a person on the grounds of their gender reassignment, for example, pay, bonus, or ability to work flexibly. An employer obviously may be able to justify different treatment if the difference is not related to gender reassignment, but instead to another factor such as experience or location. So all quite straightforward and sensible. ACAS gives the example of a man needing to take leave for medical assessments as part of his transition, who's told he will not get paid for the time off. So things like that, that's likely to be discriminatory, as the individual would have been paid if he were off work sick or injured, or is having treatment for some other health issue. So that's where it may be particularly relevant in practical terms. Also, when you're thinking about recruitment and selection, advertisements and application forms, there's an increasing move towards anonymizing in general and trying to give as few kind of physical requirements as possible in a job advert. So there's no requirement for a transsexual job applicant to tell a prospective employer that they have changed gender, either before or if they are offered a job. And obviously we suggest that a transgender job applicant should not be expected to comment on their gender identity. An employer should, in general, use gender neutral language in job adverts, if possible, they instead of he or she. Consider if it's necessary for a job applicant to identify their gender. Quite often we have that box, male, female, even adding in other. Do we really need to know? Sometimes yes, but quite often no. So that would then extend to avoiding asking for a title, Mr., Mrs., or providing a title optional, or including the ability to tick other or MX. Be sensitive to the possibility that where a background screening company perhaps is struggling to find accurate information on an individual, it may be because they've changed their name or their gender. Be aware that a trans applicant may have forms which do not tally. For instance, their passport might be in their previous gender, qualification certificates, your degree, your school qualifications, even written references. And we're not saying that you can't query that, but obviously sometimes it will be quite obvious as to what's happened, and I would only query it if there's some sort of concern or issue that you feel you need to iron out. And consider appointing a point of contact within the organisation for any potential trans applicants or issues. Someone who maybe is a bit more au fait with the language and I suppose that and the issues that may arise. So ultimately, an employer should ensure that it's necessary for an applicant to provide previous names if that's necessary. That the request is dealt with sensitively, as with all our seminars boil down to being sensitive, communicating, and when you get the information, and we're going to see a case where this did not happen, that information is provided and stored securely, and is obviously kept confidential. In the actual interview selection process, the GEO, that's the Government Equalities Office, have provided guidance on recruiting and retaining transgender staff. And so a few of their tips and suggestions are recruiting managers obviously could receive training and ongoing refresher training on best practice, and ensuring that your policies, any policy documents are up to date and obviously compliant with the law. Managers maybe need to be able to sell the benefits of the job in terms of support that's available to staff from inclusive culture and networks. The GEO guidance also reminds employers that candidates may not wish to disclose their trans status at interview, and it's certainly not a question that should be asked. It's a bit like asking a woman if she wants to have children or she's pregnant. It's best not to assume someone's gender simply by their appearance. That's obviously where we're starting to get into email sign-offs, just to make that clear, to avoid maybe any discomfort or embarrassment. In some circumstances, candidates may advise a recruitment panel that's their intention to transition. And obviously in such circumstances, you would thank the candidate for their openness, explain that you would provide support, but you obviously can still remain focused on the purpose of the interview and ultimately to determine, does this person have the skills and experience for the job, and don't feel on the back foot if that's part of the discussion in an interview. And of course, it reaches into promotion and training, and Gareth's going to touch on some of the aspects there.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, and just to reiterate something you said earlier about some of these things, you often see, or you might see, commentary around these kind of issues, and it's presented as almost a new thing, and there'll be demands for new legislation, new protections, etc. But what we're trying to do and trying to show is that actually many of the principles, the discrimination protections, the equality issues we need to consider are often the same, regardless of what protected characteristic we're talking about. But obviously, then we just have to bring to bear some of the specific sensitivities in those contexts. But by and large, the issues are always likely to be the same and require fundamentally the same sort of general, supportive, inclusive approach. So yeah, I think that's always a useful thing to remember. And just going back to something you touched on as well, Julie, around form filling and things like that at the start of employment. A few people may have experienced some of the things you can come up against with. You might want to be very inclusive within your own organization about what you ask and what you don't, but then, you know, if you start registering that person with on your payroll system with HMRC, and they'll have a, you know, a very binary selection where you've got to determine whether someone's male or female, and you come up against that with other kind of bureaucratic things where they may not be as up to speed as you are with these things. So that can pose little challenges of how you deal with things like that. I have a few people that have come up against that kind of issue. And as Julie says, just moving on to issues around promotion and training. Again, it's very similar to how we would avoid discriminating against any other protected characteristic, and that's to be very mindful that employees must not be discriminated against in relation to promotion opportunities because of their gender reassignment. So, for example, it'd be discriminatory to turn down an application for promotion because the employee's proposing to or has transitioned, discriminatory to dissuade a trans person from applying for certain roles or promotions, or to take account of gender assignment related absences. That may be discriminatory as well. Clearly as well, it would be discriminatory and amount to victimisation if we fail to promote or removed opportunities from someone who's reported a case of harassment against them or discrimination against them. We have to bear all things like that in mind. And similar considerations will apply in relation to training opportunities, discriminatory to withhold training from individuals because of their gender status, their gender reassignment, or even if that's simply perceived. So that's all to bear in mind. In terms of job adaptations and capability, a transitioning employee may wish to make temporary or short-term changes to working arrangements during or shortly after the transition process. For example, periods away from client-facing roles, working from home, changing shift patterns. Flipping that round, an employer cannot insist that changes to working arrangements take place, and indeed the ACAS guidance, which is now archived but still contains some useful information, suggests that doing so may amount to direct discrimination, and any change must be with the agreement of the transitioning employee. Dress codes is another quite important issue of how you tackle requirements for workplace uniforms and things like that. Wherever possible, clearly an employer should seek to offer a gender neutral uniform if they use uniforms. Where dress codes are different for men and women, it may be necessary to allow some flexibility in that code to accommodate either the process of transitioning from one gender to another, or for those people who may require it in other circumstances. And examples may include, for example, where there are differences, for example, or where there's a gender neutral uniform, for example, everybody regardless of gender is required to wear trousers as part of their uniform. It may actually be necessary or appropriate to allow a trans woman to wear a skirt, for example, so that others are very clear about their gender status, so that doesn't cause an unnecessary upset should there be any questions or rudeness and that kind of thing around it. Flexibility on hair and style and also things like that may be necessary at the start of transition. And there should also be flexibility for those who wish to live androgynously, so those who have a gender neutral expression in terms of their dress and would not be comfortable in a strictly feminine or masculine modes of dress. We may need to be considerate of their requests and their concerns in that regard. And those who present themselves as one gender sometimes and another on other occasions. So we talked earlier about people who are gender fluid. We may need to adapt to allow them to feel comfortable regardless of how they're identifying at a given time. And that can be done by providing them, for example, with both male and female uniforms, or one kind of common flexibility we often hear about is people may be given multiple ID passes or whatever that allow them to present on their given day as whichever gender they've identified with at that time, and it avoids conversations and needing to explain. They've got a very quick shorthand way of saying, you know, this is how I want to be greeted and addressed today. So little things like that, they'll all be very circumstance specific, but it's just getting into that mindset of considering what we can do to support and ultimately be an inclusive employer. I'm going to pass you back to Julie, who's read some case law, so you don't have to. So she's going to take you through some examples of how these things have come through the courts.
Thanks, Gareth. So the first case that we're going to look at is only from 2018, so fairly recent, but still a few shocking examples in here of what not to do. And it's the case of De Souza against Primark, or Primark, never know how to say it. So here the claimant brought claims for direct discrimination and harassment under the Equality Act in relation to gender assignment. She was a transgender woman who had lived as a woman on a permanent basis for several years. So at the time of her employment with the respondent, her official first name on her passport and national insurance was still her birth name, Alexander, although she went by the name Alexandra. So she began working as a retail assistant in Primark, and she used her female name Alexandra on her job application, but obviously then had to use her passport as identification at the interview. So that required her to explain that she was transgender and wanted to be known by her female name. At her induction, she identified herself again using her passport, but told the HR rep that she was trans and presented as a woman called Alexandra. The Primark had a system of legal name and preferred name, and the claimant's legal name rather than her preferred name was put on the rota sheet. So they started right off calling her Alexander. And this meant that several of her colleagues were immediately aware that she was transgender, and on several occasions she was subjected to discriminatory treatment because of this. So she was outed effectively by her supervisor, who called her Alexandra. Like each time he talked about her, he mentioned both names and laughed at her, and continued to refer to her as Alexander even after being corrected. The claimant's colleagues made insulting or other upsetting comments in front of her. On one occasion, a colleague sprayed scent near the claimant and said it smelled like a men's urinal. Another told an electrician that there were no ladies in the female lavatory, even though she knew the claimant was in there. And others also described her as having evil inside her, and that she was a joke. I mean, this is 2018, not 1918, but anyway. The claimant resigned because of the behaviour and the respondent's failure to deal with it. And the claimant was successful. She was awarded £47,433 and another nearly 20 grand for pension and 25 grand for injury to feelings. So that was an expensive case for Primark. But I think the takeaway for you as employers is essentially that it wasn't dealt with carefully right at the beginning, and probably also maybe didn't have suitable policies and training, but because that private information had leached out, it created problems, and there was no kind of confidentiality there, and obviously the issues that went on thereafter were not dealt with, were not remedied quickly enough. But it's not all in one direction. So you will all, as employers, have issues potentially where there are conflicting rights between trans and individuals who have something called a gender critical belief, which is under religion and philosophical belief. And I'm going to let Gareth take you through a very famous case which J.K. Rowling got involved in.
Thanks, Julie. So one of the issues, and we mentioned this when we were discussing what we would cover for today's session, is where the rights of individuals, trans individuals, can conflict with the rights of other colleagues in the workplace, and who, as Julie says, may have what are referred to as gender critical beliefs. And we know that this topic is not, we know from the discourse that you see online, you see discussions that people will, that there's lots of various opinions of this, and we're not necessarily here to say what's right or wrong, but what we are wanting to explore is where those things come into conflict and how an employer can deal with it. And as Julie says, there was one very relatively recent, couple of years ago now, but very famous case where these conflicting rights were tackled and decided upon by the Employment Appeal Tribunal. Now, the reason why things can come, these rights can be conflicting, is because, as we've been discussing today, employees are protected from discrimination and are entitled to equal treatment in relation to gender reassignment, as the terminology is under that legislation. But people also have rights and protections around their philosophical or religious beliefs, and clearly there is the potential for those things to come into conflict, as people may have either religious-based beliefs or just purely very strong personal beliefs around the gender identity. Now, there was a case regarding this philosophical belief debate, which centred on gender critical beliefs and transgenderism, which came before, as I say, the Employment Appeal Tribunal in around April 2021. And this is the case of Forstater and Centre for Global Development. Now, many may have seen this at the time. Social media was all over at the time, as they say, and in particular the hashtag of I Stand With Maya. And this was all to do with a relatively well-known claimant who was a researcher and a writer who'd entered into a consultancy agreement with the Centre for Global Development. Now, she wrote a number of tweets concerning the proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act that we talked about earlier, which would allow people to self-identify their gender. Now, some of the respondents, the employer's staff, raised concerns about those tweets and alleged that they were transphobic. And now, Ms. Forstater wasn't necessarily dismissed as a result of this, but when her consultancy positions came to be renewed, they weren't renewed. And she contended that the reason for that was because the Centre for Global Development, who she was working for, didn't like or was took against her gender critical opinions that she'd expressed. And she brought an employment tribunal claim alleging direct discrimination on the grounds that she was entitled to those beliefs, and it wasn't, and it amounted to discrimination that she was not, her consultancy positions were not renewed as a result of the comments that she made. Ultimately, the judgment from the Employment Appeal Tribunal concluded that the belief that sex is biologically immutable, i.e. that there are simply two sexes biologically, male and female, and that men are adult males and that women are adult females. Having that opinion and having the opinion that biological sex is the fundamentally important factor rather than someone's gender or their identity or their expression. Having that belief, the EAT found, did amount to a philosophical belief that should be protected under the Equality Act. So the EAT were not saying that they agreed with that opinion that Ms. Forstater had expressed, but they were saying that she was entitled to have that philosophical belief, and therefore, having this, she was entitled to be protected from discrimination on the grounds of it. Now, this was a landmark decision. It overturned the initial employment tribunal, which basically found the opposite, and had held that the particular belief that a person's sex is a material reality which should not be conflated with gender or identity, was not a belief that was compatible with fundamental rights of others, and was not a belief worthy of respect in a democratic society. And so the original tribunal had concluded that it should not be a philosophical belief protected under the Equality Act. So that's all to do with, we could do a whole other webinar about that, but in terms of meeting the test of showing that your belief is worthy of protection, you have to show that it's not incompatible with the rights of others and it's worthy of respect in a democratic society. When that case came before the EAT, they decided that it at least met those thresholds, and that she should be protected for those beliefs in that context. So quite a complicated case, but it obviously did make a lot of headlines. It tried to simplify what it was all about, but it is quite an interesting example of how those cases are being decided in the employment tribunal system. Now, there is a limit, however, to holding those gender critical beliefs in the workplace. So that case that we just talked about there didn't just give carte blanche to employees to act in any way they want and justify it by having a gender critical belief. There is a limit to that protection they had, and Julie's going to take us through a even more recent case that dealt with that limit.
Thanks, Gareth. And Susan, I see your question about toilets, and that is something that we're going to come on to, because that is something that we are frequently asked about. So off the back of Forstater, there was a case of a Christian doctor who refused to address a transgender person by their chosen pronoun. And that doctor unsuccessfully argued in the employment tribunal that his dismissal amounted to discrimination on the basis of his religious belief. And that was essentially because although gender critical beliefs are capable of protection in law, the policy that was operated by his employer, which compelled its health and disability assessors, including the claimant, to use the preferred pronoun and mode of address of trans service users, was justified in the circumstances of the case, and the respondent had not acted unlawfully against him. Effectively, what they were saying is that you believe this, and trans people obviously believe that, and we don't think it overrides your beliefs to be asked to be respectful effectively to a person who's asking you to call them he or she or MX or Mrs. or whatever it may be. So as I say, there is a limit to that right, and it's quite often where the behaviour could be seen as disrespectful ultimately and unreasonable. Having training policies and training and progressive policies in place was highlighted in a case. This is the last case we're going to go over, Taylor against Jaguar Land Rover. Here, it was in relation to a non-binary or gender fluid individual. So the claimant in the case was a long-standing engineer who worked in Jaguar Land Rover's plant, who from 2017
Has Julie gone on mute?
Julie, I think you've just gone on mute accidentally.
my words of wisdom. I'll just quickly recap.
That was the best bit, that as well.
So we're talking about Taylor and Jaguar Land Rover, and it's a case that highlights the importance ultimately of training progressive policies. So it referred to a claimant who was a long-standing engineer with Jaguar, and from 2017 informed their employer that they were transgender, and they were on a spectrum transitioning from male to female gender identity, but that they self-ID'd as gender fluid and non-binary and had no plans for surgical transition. And from that time, that person, they usually dressed in women's clothing, as a result of which they were subjected to abusive insults and jokes, and had issues regarding which toilet facilities they should use, and had been given inadequate support by HR and management. And essentially, Jaguar pointed to a set of policies that they had, but they were basically collecting dust in a room, and in the tribunal nobody was very sure what they had said, if they'd ever what the policies said, if they'd ever seen them. So there was beautiful policies that were not given out and updated and reviewed, and no training linked to them. So the policies were basically completely and utterly meaningless and did not help the employer to defend that claim. So that was a whistle-stop tour of kind of the legal situation. And if you ever have a particular issue, we would always advise you just come and speak to us, because they're always quite fact specific. So I think we just wanted at the end to touch on an awareness generally, just a few things that will frequently crop
I can't
up.
get out now. I was going to go.
Sorry, Susan, we can hear you, just in case you didn't realise. Essentially, management and training is obviously a key, equipping individuals with the appropriate knowledge and language and practical tools. And there are a few common issues that were asked about, as I mentioned to Susan. Toilets. This quite often crops up in case law, and the answer really is it depends on the size and resources of your business. So a very large employer with really quite big offices and a decent budget quite often will have 3 sets, which is men, women and gender neutral. That's, I suppose, the kind of gold standard. Or you can have 1 or 2, and quite often as well, the fact that they're each within the male toilets or within the female toilets, the fact that there are then also cubicles with locking doors and floor to ceiling dividers, because sometimes what you will have is not the trans person who has a concern about which toilets to use. It's perhaps other employees who would say, I'm not comfortable being in the female toilets with someone who is used to be a man, I mean, effectively. And so locking and privacy is very helpful in those situations. And it's quite a lot of new government buildings will have the 3 sets of toilets, male, female and gender neutral. And then the smaller the business goes, obviously it's any sort of take on that to the best of your ability, and ultimately again having locks and single cubicles, even if that is literally 1 toilet with a lock on the door, and it's self-contained, so the basin is in where the loo is. Didn't ever think after 7 years of training to be a lawyer I'd be chatting about loos, but there we are. That's what we are talking about. So again, that's a way to tackle it, and then you wouldn't have the signage male, female. It's just a toilet to be used. So again, if any questions on that specifically, but if you can designate gender neutral, that can be quite useful, but it's not a cure-all, because some people will say, well, I'm not gender neutral, I am now a woman and I want to use the female facilities. So that is where you can get into some issues, but locks are the key. Accurate internal records being updated. So if on someone's payslip you keep referring to them as Julie, but they now want to be Julian, that it's simple things like that can wear a person down and cause them to accuse you of not being sensitive and perhaps direct discrimination, when it's actually maybe a really easy fix. And just making sure that your internal records have been updated to reflect the appropriate gender identity. If you issue signage, for instance, name badges or whatever, you may not want to faff about with title. I don't imagine most people would now. Mrs. Julie Sabbath's a bit formal, but it might just be easier to have Julie, rather than, you know, a surname or a title. And we've discussed already so that some people will be allowed to, or will be furnished with 2 identity badges if they change their identity on a regular basis or even an infrequent basis. And another one you will find, I'm sure, popping up quite often at the moment, literally in your email box, the sign-off pronouns. You'll see Julie Saba and underneath she, her. So that's something that you can adopt in your organisation. I would counsel against making it mandatory. Some people will not want to have to, for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons maybe being because they hold gender critical views. So wouldn't make it mandatory, but it may be useful to allow some people to make their gender identity clear before they speak to someone or meet with someone. And you can also have, you know, email pictures popping up when someone emails you. Some people will prefer not to have that. Perhaps if they're transitioning, they don't want to have to do that. So just be mindful, I suppose, of things that you may take as run of the mill that someone may want to kind of pull back from, and just be sensitive if they do voice a concern about it, and try and facilitate them as much as possible without obviously compromising perhaps business requirements. But I think, as we mentioned earlier, communication really is key, and you've seen how vast the language is. So, you know, it can be hard to get it right, and certainly shouldn't be presuming, and the best person to guide you as to what they need will be the person who is needing your support because they are transitioning or have transitioned, or they are non-binary, etc., and just be guided by them as to how you can make their working life easier within, obviously, normal boundaries and commercial concerns. And as I say, if there's a conflict between the two and you have other members of staff that perhaps concerned, speak to Gareth and I, and we can assist you. But again, the bottom line would be maintaining confidentiality of all concerned, and listening to what the concerns are. And if they're unreasonable, sometimes someone will just have to be told, well, that's just tough, in a better, more HR polished way. But sometimes you will be able to accommodate and keep both people happy. So there you go, a whistle-stop tour, which I have to say was an education for me as well. So I hope you found it useful. I don't know if you've got any questions. Gareth and I'll give it a bash.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. If there are any questions, please fire away.
Hi, Gareth. Hi, Julie.
Hi,
Just one question. We can legislate what we can do with our employees with a transgender policy, but what do we do about customers that can be quite offensive at times, even to normal people?
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to transgender, how do we?
Because
because we're controlled by cost, we can't automatically just bar them. We have to go through a process.
Of course. What would you do if someone was being racist to one of your members of staff?
Yeah.
Just probably the same sort of thing, because
yeah.
if I mean, ultimately it depends on the level of abuse, but regardless of what's at the heart of any abuse, you would obviously use you've got a responsibility for their health and safety, and it could obviously be intimidating. So you would use health and safety kind of legislation and obligations to inform your decision. And I suppose ultimately, like anything else, can ultimately call the police if it gets really serious. And you don't have to be overly concerned about the nuance of their views. If someone is being offensive, you will, of course, perhaps get I think of my dad, bless him, who would completely and accidentally blunder in perhaps,
Yes.
and say, he was just getting my drink, he's taking ages, and
Yes.
that person wants to be considered a female. I
Yeah.
don't think there's a lot you can do there other than things that we've said about kind of signage and you know, maybe having the colleagues trained sensitively to say, do you want to step back and I'll deal with this customer? But I think your obligation can only extend so far, and society and cultural shifts are changing. And I think that's more common, the accidental offence rather than abuse.
Yes, deliberate. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that point, Julie, was a really good one as well, in terms of how would you deal with other scenarios, and really it's treating that with the same issues. So we would clearly tackle a racist incident, we would tackle just even if it doesn't attract to a protected characteristic, just something abusive, we would tackle it. So we go through the same steps with this. We don't just ourselves kind of impose an extra layer of, we don't treat that seriously because we don't consider that a serious issue. It's on a par with it, so we tackle it in the same way. But then, to an extent, as Julie says, there's only so far we can do it.
I've heard of employers having things like allyship training, which basically means you're training all staff to be aware of it, so that your organisation and your staff are deemed allies of the LGBTQ plus community, and that would be a very useful defence if there was anything untoward that happened, for instance, between colleagues, if you have taken steps to address it and minimise any problems. But yes, once you, and you know, even training staff how to deal with a blundering 70-odd-year-old who's misgendering someone, I think that's as far as you as an employer should have to and would be expected to take it at this stage.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. I think it's something that we now need to bring to, you know, closer to the top of our agenda, that we actually start training on this sort of topic.
Yeah.
Any other questions? No?
Stunned
Very good.
silence.
Yeah.
Everyone's just letting it sink in. It's a lot. I mean, I was saying to Gareth that I would have thought describing someone as a cross-dresser would be more, it sounds more casual and slang and therefore more offensive than describing someone as transvestite, but that is not the case. So that's an area where you can accidentally offend someone. There's obvious things that would not be acceptable. I think back to my days in Glasgow of describing people as trannies and unthinkingly, really just obviously is, we're not talking about obvious things that would be considered offensive, but it's the nuance of language, and it does change a lot actually. Stonewall is another good organisation that can help online keeping up with appropriate terminology.
Yeah, it's definitely
Absolutely.
a lot of food for thought, isn't it? Very interesting, very helpful. I suppose when you really pull it back, as you were saying, I think what stuck out for me was the mention of how would you deal with racism, and you know, also if you unpick quite a lot of it, actually you can think, well, there's quite a lot of occasions whereby it could be a neutral, the gender neutral, you know, there's not necessarily actually the need for he, she, or you know, depending on but yeah, a couple of terms surprised me, and I thought I was quite, well, I was going to say up on this kind of thing, and definitely not. But there's a lot to consider and to continue to keep considering, isn't there? So it's definitely very interesting.
Good.
Good.
Yes, I think the modern workplace is much more gender neutral. So as you say, most people wouldn't necessarily think that there were areas where it could be problematic, but sometimes the gender neutrality is the issue.
Yes.
But again, I think as an employer, you only have to take that so far. As long as you have a reasoning to justify any decision that affects everybody, and a refusal for any flexibility, that's where you have to have a decent rationale, which sometimes will be the case. Maybe for health and safety, someone can't wear a long flowing skirt, they would have to be in trousers. So common sense should always prevail.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. We've gone on a little bit longer, but we just had so much to cover. So glad you found it useful. And if, as Julie was mentioning a couple of times, these will be quite specific issues or circumstance specific. So don't hesitate to get in touch if you do have any queries or follow-up questions from today.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for
Perfect.
coming.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Take care everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.